Hello, this is Lucy O'Hagan from Wild Awake, and today I'm here to answer all of your amazing questions that you've asked me about living as a cave person and how our ancestors lived in the past. So Juno, who is 9, has asked me, I heard that prehistoric people did paintings in caves. Did Irish cave people do any paintings? So thank you for this question, Juno. So in Ireland, we have what's known as megalithic art. So our ancestors, rather than using paints, what we can see and what has been left are these megalithic carvings on the rocks. So if you've ever been to Newgrange or Knowth or Loughcrew or lots of places around Ireland, you'll see these engravings on the rocks. And our ancestors would have used stone tools to peck and carve these designs into the rock. So they may have done paintings as well. We don't know. We haven't found any evidence of that. But what has lasted are these carvings on the rocks. Juno has also asked me how prehistoric people managed without toilets. So I can only speak from my own experience living outside for long periods of time, and it really wasn't a problem. So quite often I will go and pee behind a tree, even if I'm just out in the woods anyway. And if I need to do a number 2, it's really important to dig a hole, which is probably as deep as your hand, and poo into the hole. And then right now, loads of people are thinking about what can we use as, like, what do we do if toilet roll runs out? But I never had toilet roll, and I always used moss. And there are even some mosses like sphagnum moss, which have antibacterial and disinfectant properties. So they're actually really good to use. But there are also loads of leaves that we can use as well. You just have to make sure that the leaves themselves aren't toxic. But I think they managed fine without toilets. And I actually think it's kind of weird that we poo into a white ceramic bowl and flush it away with the water. Just feels like a big waste to me. So yeah, try peeing behind a tree next time you're able to be outside. So Zoe, hi Zoe, who is 10, has asked me, how did our ancestors make paint? So this is a great question, and one that you can still really play with and experiment with now. So essentially our ancestors would have ground up rocks, and river rocks are really great to do this. If you pick up a rock and you can use it to draw and make a mark on another rock, then you can take that rock and grind it up with some other rocks into a powder and then mix it with water to make a paint. So our ancestors would have used rocks like the red ochre that we see in a lot of cave paintings would have come from a rock, and they would have mixed it with their own saliva. And if you've ever seen on some of the cave paintings, they have these handprints on the walls. They would have mixed up the paint in their hand with a little bit of spit, and then put that in their mouth and spit all over their hand to create this kind of stencil effect. And we've also made charcoal. So, you know, if you make a fire at the end, you're left with charcoal, which can be ground up to make an amazing white color. So I'd really recommend this book. It's backwards there, but it's The Organic Artist for Kids by a guy called Nick Netto. And in this book, he shows you how to make paints from rocks, how to make natural glues, how to make natural paintbrushes and crayons. It's a really fun one that you can experiment with, even when you're indoors. Gabriel, hi Gabriel, who is 9, has asked me, in what parts of the world did cave people live? Also, is there anywhere in the world where people still live in caves? So this is a really great question, Gabriel. Thank you for asking. So essentially our ancestors lived in caves for millennia when they could. And it wasn't just our species of human, you know, we are human, Homo sapiens, but also the different species of humans, the Neanderthals and the Homo erectus would have lived in caves. So caves give shelter, they give protection from different predators that are out in the wild, and there would have been these huge megafauna roaming the earth. So yeah, they provided a really safe space for humans to sit around the fire and to tell stories and to live in a safe way. So we find evidence of people living in caves from Africa up into Europe, in Ireland, across to Asia, in Australia, all over the world. And is there anywhere where people still live in caves? So I really enjoyed actually finding out more about this question. And actually, if we think about it, there's probably more people living in caves nowadays than there ever has been in human history. So when I looked into this, I found out that there's actually 3 million people in China who live in caves, who choose to live in caves, because they're still like these beautiful architectural earth structures that are very cool. And then there are people even in the south of Spain who live in caves who choose just this simple way of life. Yeah, so yes, there are still people who live in caves. Gabriel has also asked me, why do you think Newgrange was built? So, gosh, Gabriel, there are so many different theories about why people think Newgrange was built. The truth is, because it's prehistory, Newgrange was built by Neolithic farmers, and we don't have like any records from that time, so we don't know. So there are lots of different ideas. Personally, I think it's because our ancestors had a lot more connection with the land and with the ancestors. So they created these huge structures. And if we think of Newgrange, you know, it's this enormous structure that was built so that on 1 or 2 days of the year, on the winter solstice, the sun would travel through the column and light up the inner chamber, which is very small in comparison to the actual mound. So we think of these people of having a huge respect for their ancestors and for the land, and really rejoicing in the return of the sun. So yeah, for me, it's just an incredible window into how these people lived so closely with the seasons and with their dead. So our next question comes from Emily, and Emily has asked, what would life have been like for cave kids? So again, we don't know for sure, but one thing that I can say is that when we look to Indigenous groups of people living around the world, and we see how they raise their children, and these are people who are still living very connected to the land, we notice that they place a huge emphasis on play, and they just let children play. And any of my friends who try to raise their children in a more natural way will just, yeah, they see the value in play. And what children will do quite often is they will copy what the adults are doing. So they might play how to hunt an animal, they might play how to tan a hide, they might play how to, you know, dig roots or whatever it is, but they're learning through play how to do these things that are so essential to the survival and the culture of the people there. So I imagine that it would have been pretty fun life for cave kids. So next up we have Belle. Hi Belle. Belle is 10 and she would like to ask, how did they make medicines? So this is always really fun for me to think of because I still make my own medicines from plants. And obviously, you know, our ancestors wouldn't have had what I have in my herbal apothecary, like loads of jars or like alcohols to preserve, but they would have had a really intimate knowledge of the plants and what they were good for. So we don't know how they figured this out. Some people suggest that they watched animals and saw what animals were eating, but animals can eat toxic plants that humans can't. And lots of Indigenous groups around the world will say that the plants actually tell them what they're useful for, you know, like how they can heal them. So a really interesting field of study of how people would have or might communicate with plants. And there's a lovely story actually just to demonstrate how our ancestors had this connection with the plants is about RTÉ, the Iceman. So RTÉ, there were two hikers and they were hiking through the Swiss Alps and they came across a body. And they thought, you know, it was just somebody who had died recently, and they called the emergency services. And when they arrived, they actually found out that this person was actually close to 5,000 years old, and he was perfectly preserved in the ice. And he became known as RTÉ the Iceman. And there's a film about him, there are books about him, but all of his clothes, his shoes were perfectly preserved. So this amazing window into the past. And on RTÉ's belt, he had a mushroom. So this mushroom grows in Ireland. It's called birch polypore, and it's also become known as the Iceman fungus. And birch polypore has lots of medicinal properties. And when they did an autopsy, when they actually cut open RTÉ to find out what his body was like, they discovered that he had worms in his intestines. So birch polypore is a medicine that can be used to treat those worms. So even 5,000 years ago, our ancestors knew precisely which mushroom to use to treat something in their body. And even older than that, we find remains of plants in caves, you know, like lots of plants that herbalists will still use now, like yarrow, were found in these really, really, like some of the most ancient caves. So yeah, and I also think, I find it really interesting to think about how animals use plants to heal themselves. And one thing that we notice with animals is that they will just avoid trying to get sick, or they will avoid conflict. They will avoid ways where they might be vulnerable to death or to being predated. And I think our human ancestors would have had that understanding as well. You know, they lived very healthily. They didn't have a lot of the same like diseases that we have now. So they would have focused more on keeping themselves well rather than treating disease when it arises. So that's what I think. So one of the reasons that I was asked to do this for RTÉ Junior is that over the past couple of years, I've spent time living outside, trying to find ways to live just as our ancestors might have done. So the next few questions are related directly to my own experiences. So the first one is from Sive. Hi Sive, who is 9 years old. And Sive wants to know, what did you eat? How did you get your food? And how did you eat it? So I love talking about food. Foraging for wild foods is one of my favorite things to do. So what did we eat? Yeah, so the most recent time that I had an experience like this was in February, where I went up to the north of Finland. So just 100 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. And this was in February, so it was ranging from 2 degrees to minus 20 degrees, and we were living in birch shelters, birch bark shelters. So there we had a full reindeer, which we ate, and we were using all of the animal. So we would eat the meat, but we would also use the fat, and we would also boil the bones for food as well. So in that case, it was a local reindeer herder, who gave us the reindeer. But in the past, we've also fished for our food. So we've made and used nets, made bone hooks to catch fish. And other people would have hunted larger animals or trapped larger animals, but that's not something that I've had an experience of yet. But also foraging foods. So, you know, in the wild, there are so many plants that we can eat, and this is how our ancestors would have survived. So there are lots of roots and mushrooms and nuts and berries and seaweeds and green plants and flowers and tree barks. There's so much wild food out there if you know where to look and how to find it. So we would spend a lot of time gathering this food. And I think what our ancestors would have done is to move to places like with the seasons of the food. So when there was an abundance of shellfish and seaweeds, they would have moved to the coast. And maybe when there was like more abundance in the forest, they would have moved there. So we're kind of moving with the seasons of the wild food. And how did we eat it? So fire, like such an amazing, amazing thing. And what fire allowed our ancestors to do is to eat foods and to cook foods. So if we imagine meat, fire allowed them to cook meat, which meant that they could eat it, that their bodies were digesting it in a better way, where they could get more energy from them, which freed up so much more time for storytelling and socializing and developing languages. So fire is kind of central to everything, I feel. So we would have cooked a lot of meat over the fire. We also had a clay pot, which was like our collective clay pot that we would have made stews in, with the bones, and put in mushrooms and berries and things that we'd gathered throughout the year. And we can also cook directly on the fire, on the embers, on sticks. We can smoke food, we can ferment it. There are lots of different ways to preserve food. Sive also wants to know, where did you sleep and how long for? So I've slept in lots of different places. So for 1 month, I lived in a kind of cave, like a cliff overhang in France, in a place called the Verzères Valley. And this valley is really important because it's where some of the most famous caves and cave art comes from. So caves like Lascaux and Fond-de-Gaume. So our ancestors would have lived there about 35,000 years ago, is when a lot of these cave paintings were from. So we were living outside in the caves there. There are so many of them, and we walked from caves to caves. And when I was living up in Sweden, we also moved around a lot. So we would have slept out in the forest sometimes. Once we built a big group shelter that we could all cuddle into. And in Finland, we were in a replica museum. So if you imagine a little bit like the Irish National Heritage Park, if you've ever been there. So our ancestors in Ireland would have used wood and brushes, because that was the materials that was really abundant to construct our houses in. But in Finland, there's an abundance of birch trees, and also rushes and wood. So they would have used a combination of this. So at that time in Finland, thankfully, because it was so cold, we had a shelter that was already built. And this was so amazing at like just giving us a little bit more warmth in the night. We did have a thermometer to check the temperature. And I think there was a difference of about like 7 degrees inside versus outside the shelter. So so it was really, really important to have shelter, and still is. So, you know, we can have shelters that are built for the long term, but equally we would have built just, you know, small shelters or find shelters out in the wild, like caves or like big thick trees that provide lots of shelter, or so, and how long for? Lots of time, from 1 night to 1 month to 3 months is the longest I've spent living outside. Cody, age 10, has asked me, I would like to know what you would make a bed out of. So in the past, I have used skins from animals, particularly up in the north of Scandinavia. There are a lot of reindeer, and because the reindeer live in such a cold climate, they have very thick hair. So even one reindeer skin makes a very comfy bed. Otherwise, we've used moss, makes a really comfy bed, dried leaves, the branches of spruce trees or pine trees. And I actually have a friend who once made a bed out of holly. And yeah, if you can imagine, this was very prickly, but he put his skin over the top of the holly, and it was kind of like a very bouncy mattress. It was the most comfortable bed I've ever slept on. So yeah, that's a great question, because it's important that if you're working very hard during the day, that you get enough sleep. And I imagine people would have varied how often they slept when I was up in Scandinavia in the summer, it was daylight for the whole 2 months that I was there. So it was really hard to sleep for any more than maybe 6 hours at a time. But if you think of, you know, in those times, it would have been a time for our ancestors to be really productive, to make lots of clothes, lots of tools, to really like profit from the amount of light. Whereas in the winter, when there's so much more darkness, it would have been more time for huddling around the fire, telling stories, playing music, singing songs. So we really change how we sleep and how we interact depending on the seasons. So Alice, age 10, has asked, can you be a vegetarian whilst living as a cave woman? Well, Alice, you have just highlighted what is a huge debate about our ancestors. Some people think that they were meat eating all the time, just like hunters. And lots of people think that they actually depended on plants as part of their diet, mostly. Again, we don't know, but I imagine that gathering, like really we should call ourselves gatherer hunters, because gathering wild foods, vegetarian foods, would have been much more successful than hunting. So it's thought that maybe eating meat was something that was much more occasional than we think. So Sasha, aged 5, thank you so much for this question, Sasha. She has asked, why don't you live in a house? And what does it sound like in the wild? So these questions fit perfectly together because I do have a house, but I love what it sounds like in the wild. So that's why I love to spend my time there. Because when you sleep outside, when you live outside, you're much more aware of all the different noises around you. So it's never silent, really. There's the sound of the wind, which changes. There's the sound of the birds, which change. There's the sound of animals creeping past in the night, or there's the sound of the fire crackling, or your community around you, like snoring or mumbling. So there's all these beautiful sounds, and I really hope that you get to experience that sound soon, Sasha. Nessa, hi Nessa, age 9, has asked me, what was your favorite food? This is a hard one, but I've settled on something called pemmican. So pemmican is a food, it was made a lot by Native Americans, and it consists of dried meat pounded together with fat and mixed together with wild dried berries. So this, like, you make it into a ball and you can carry that ball with you, and it just gives you all the protein, the fat, the vitamins and the minerals that you need to keep going for a long time. So they're kind of like an energy ball. Imagine like a bird feeder ball, but for a human, and they're really, really delicious. So yeah, pemmican. So Maeve has asked a really important question too, actually. So how do you know when a wild mushroom is okay to eat? And what wild berries are okay to eat and which ones are poisonous? So this is a really important question, Maeve. Thank you for asking. So you don't know. It's not something that you can just know. It's something that you learn. So yeah, I've spent about 10 years of my life learning about wild food, whether that's mushrooms or plants or trees or seaweeds, and there's no rule, you know, you have to go and learn it. So great places to learn from are books, and I actually have a great book here called Foraging with Kids by Adele Nosdar, and that's a great book for kids and their families to start with. Or to come out with a foraging instructor, a teacher who will show you what is safe to eat. But it's so, so important that you never eat anything unless you are 100% sure. Not 99%, 100% sure. Manuela, hi Manuela, who is 7, has asked me, is it possible to track animals in an urban setting? Can we use or make any type of footprint trap as to know which animals are visiting our road? So yes, it is possible. And you might have seen some of the photos that have come out online recently of foxes crossing the Halfpenny Bridge in Dublin. And a lot of these wild animals coming back into the city now that the humans aren't as busy there. But animals do live in the city, and I actually find more fox tracks in the city than I do in the countryside. And that's because there is so much extra food for them. So the Phoenix Park is full of wildlife. There are badgers and foxes, and you can even, you could track birds as well. So one great way to do this is to lay out something called a sand trap. So if you get some sand, and just put it out on your garden or in your house, and then just wait. You might want to put a little bit of food on the trap, which will attract more animals, and they'll walk in the sand and leave their footprints. And then you can look in any good books. So there's one here, Animal Tracks and Signs. It's a Collins guide, and this is a brilliant one to help you identify the tracks of the wild animals that are living close by to you. Salome, hi Salome, age 10, has asked me, if you could bring only 2 things into the forest to survive, what would you bring? Great question, Salome, and I was thinking about this a lot this morning, and I wondered if you would allow me to bring a friend, because you said thing, but I'm thinking, if I was to pick 2 anything, I would definitely bring a friend with me, because you have somebody to enjoy life with, to sing with, to play with, and to help with everything that we need to get to live outside. But if we're talking about things, then I would definitely bring my knife, because my knife will help me to process firewood, to make a bow drill set so that I can make fire with that. It would help me to process animals if I needed to, or plants in any ways that I needed to. A knife is a very, very useful tool. And the second thing would be a container. So when I think about what our basic needs as humans are, it would be water and food is the first 2. Also shelter and company. But a container allows me to get water, and also to gather food in and to cook in. So yeah, a knife and a container. So our final question today comes from Foilon, age 10. And Foilon's asked a really important question. So what is the #1 tip for staying in the wild for the longest time possible? And for me, the answer is very, very clear. Community is the most important thing if you want to stay out in the wild for the longest time possible. And if we think about going out into the woods and being in the wild, sometimes we don't want to just survive. Sometimes we want to live out there for a long time so that we have an amazing experience, that we enjoy our time there. And that's really only possible when you have a group of people who are doing that with you. So in a community, you can all help to gather firewood, you can help to gather food, you can help to do like the chores that there might be to fix the shelter or to make the clothes. And also community means that you're having a good time. Like it means that you can tell stories together, that you can sing together, that you can, just explore what it means to be human together. And in my experience, that's been the best thing about the work that I do, is the community that comes with it. So thank you all for your questions today. I've really enjoyed answering all of them. And I really hope that sometime in the near future, we can all meet again in the woods in the Phoenix Park.